Good afternoon, all. Today I want to talk about not one of the best, but one of the worst, perhaps the worst, science fiction television series of the 1970s, and that's not 1973's The Starlost. Why was this show so terrible? Well, everything went wrong that possibly could go wrong. In a guess about 1972, Harlan Ellison was approached by an executive at one of the big movie studios and said, we're working on a TV development deal as a co-production with the BBC, and one of the things they want to do is a science fiction show. Would you be interested in writing it? And he said, yeah, but there was a writer's strike on at the time, and not only was Ellison a member of the Writers Guild of America West, he was on the board of directors of the Writers Guild of America West, so he obviously could not write anything while they were on strike. He said, well, the executive says, well, what if we do something like The Fugitive in space? And Ellison says, no, that's dumb. You know, The Fugitive's already been done, and if we just rehash it, it's going to be boring. Let's do something original. He said, well, what have you got? And Ellison's kind of kicking around for ideas. He says, what if we do a story about an enclosed universe? He says, well, what's that? He says, well, suppose there's some people on a spaceship, and it's a generational ship, and they've been on it for so long that they don't know they're on a spaceship, and something's gone wrong. They're off course. They're headed for a collision course, and these rather backwards people, one of them gets ejected from his society and accidentally stumbles onto this secret, and now he has to convince people that they're off course and they have to find the bridge, which is way at the back of the ship, which is 200 miles long. So they have this long journey that they have to go through, and they meet different cultures, etc. each week. And he said, well, that's great. Can you write down? He says, no, I can't write anything down. You know, there's a strike. He couldn't do a treatment or anything. He said, well, can you just put it on tape recorder? He says, yeah, I'll put it on the tape recorder, you know, under the promise that you're not going to write this down in any form. He said, oh, don't worry, we won't, which of course was a lie. But so he goes and he retorts his idea, which was, he said, was just like 12 minutes of him rambling about what he thought the show should be like, and, you know, what the characters are like, and, you know, the development, blah, blah, blah. And the executive was impressed, so he starts putting together a team. He's going to get Doug Trumbull to do the special effects. He's going to get some, you know, people on board, you know, and unfortunately the BBC passed on it. They weren't interested. So he starts pitching around to some other people. Meanwhile, he's pressuring Ellison to write the quote-unquote Bible. The Bible in a TV series is a book that tells everything about, you know, everything about the characters, about the plot, about the sets and the props and the production values and the lighting, et cetera, so that the people who are working on the show, you know what they're getting into. And he said, you know, I can't do it. There's a strike on, and, you know, I refuse. Well, eventually, the producer got some interest from not the BBC, but CTV in Canada, in Toronto, and said, they said they were interested. Calls up Ellison again and says, you know, we've got the CTV in Toronto wants to produce it. Would that be okay with you? And, you know, he says, yeah, but again, you know, I can't write anything on it right now. He's pressuring him, you know, they need scripts, they need the Bible, they need, you know, work done. And, you know, just, you know, hawking him. And, you know, he wouldn't budge. And because, again, he couldn't, you know, he could have been sued, and he was actually sued by the Writers Guild of America for violating the strike terms. But a couple of odd things happened, and I'm not going to go into, you know, gory detail here. If you want to learn more about this, there are two excellent audio recordings on YouTube that give the entire details, including all the names of these people, most of whom I've forgotten. But, and, you know, the progression of how these things went from bad to worse. So they start putting together this Canadian production team, which is made up of people who have not only never done a science fiction TV series, they've never done a TV series, period. So they don't know what the heck they're doing. And these are going to be the producers of the show and the directors. Ellison starts objecting, and they, you know, poo-poo him, you know, oh, you're just the writer, you know, typical kind of stuff that goes on in Hollywood and elsewhere when a writer tries to assert his rights over his material. Two odd things happened. One, Ellison was in the executive's office, discussing the series, which didn't have a name yet, and he was flipping through a Screen Actors Guild dossier of available actors and saw a very beautiful woman and made some kind of a comment about her. And a couple of weeks later, after this took place, Said woman just happened to show up at his door. Now, Ellison lived in a very obscure area of Coldwater Canyon. It's known as Wonderland, and it is not easy to get to. And she shows up and says, "I just happen to be in the neighborhood." He says, "In the neighborhood? Why are you just in the neighborhood? You don't have to know," and says the executive's name. And she says, "Yeah, I do know him, and he recommended that I talk to you, and I'm a fan of your work." Well, after talking to her about 5 minutes, it became evident to Ellison that she was not a fan of his work and probably had never read one of his stories in her entire life, and he threw her out. The other thing that happened was he starts talking to somebody, another writer. I say, "Oh, we were hearing that there's this Bible that's going around for a series," and he starts describing the series, and it's his series. And he says, "What the heck, who's writing it?" And he tells them it's somebody who was apparently on the outs with Ellison. Now, I do not know 100% who this was. He just said it was a writer living in Berkeley. I am 99% certain it was Robert Sheckley. And anyway, he meets with whoever this writer was. Ellison asked to meet with him and said, "Are you working on something? Are you working on a Bible?" And he said, "Yeah, I am." And he starts talking to me. He said, "You can't do that. That's my series. And, there's a strike on. We can't do this." And the guy was kind of hesitant. And he said, "Well, they said we're going to give me $1,200 for, 1 weekend's worth of work." I said, "Look, I'll give you twice as much if you don't do it." And he says, "You want to see how big scumbags these guys are?" And he says, "Yeah, sure." He says, go in the bathroom." He's in a hotel. There's a telephone in the bathroom. He puts him on the extension, calls up the executive and says, "Hey, is anybody working on the Bible for this series except me?" And he says, "No." He says, "No other American writers." He says, "Or are there any British writers? Are there any Canadian writers? Are there any Australian writers working on it?" He says, "No, nobody's working on it, I promise you." Says, "Oh, okay. I just wanted to check in." Hangs up. And then he goes to talk to the other guy. And he says, "You see what I mean?" And he says, "Yeah, I get it." And he says, "Well, let's do this. Let's take your copy of the Bible to the Writers Guild and tell them what's going on. And we'll go tomorrow morning." He says, "Okay." So they go to the Writers Guild, and the other writer tells them, what happened and, how much they offer to pay him, etc. And he brings the copy. He only had 2 copies, and he brought 1 copy and gave it to the Writers Guild. Promised Ellison he was going to destroy the other copy. It never came out, but apparently somebody had, either he or somebody else had made a photocopy because it keeps showing up on the internet. Even now. But even he agreed it was terrible, that it was an awful Bible, and he didn't want it done that way. So, writer's strike ends. Ellison is now called up to Canada. They're going to produce it in Canada. CTV, as I said, wants it. And he's working on the Bible, and now which the Writers Guild strike is over now, so he can work on it. And gives them the basic idea. Well, instantly, they start saying, "We can't do this and we can't do that, and it's going to be too expensive, blah, blah, blah." One of the things that was supposed to work on this series was Doug Trumbull, who had done the special effects on 2001: A Space Odyssey, was going to do the special effects. And he had invented a new process called Magic Cam. What Magic Cam was, it was a system of photography that allowed him to film miniature sets, and then he could project the actors onto those sets so that you didn't have to build big sets, which was an advantage for CTV because they didn't have a lot of money and they couldn't afford to build an entire interior starship, set. But if they didn't have to, that would cut that out. Well, long story short, it didn't work. They had to end up doing some practical sets and using regular blue screen effects, which did not particularly work well on a low budget. Again, I don't blame the production. They did the best they could at the time. But there's also a huge amount of incompetence, particularly on the part of they hired writers who'd never written science fiction. They hired producers who'd never made a science fiction series. And the kicker is Ellison was meeting with the executives in L.A. They're in one of these buildings that has an outside glass elevator. And he said, "Oh, you'll never guess who we got to play Devon," was the main character. He says, "Who?" He said, "Kier Dullea." Ellison hits the stop button. He says, "Kier Dullea? What are you thinking? This guy's supposed to be a salt-of-the-earth farmer. He's basically an Amishman. We need somebody who can play." I was thinking of Walter Koenig or Peter Falk to play Devon. Kier Dullea is like a silver spoon kind of guy. He looks like, he belongs in on a throne somewhere. He doesn't look like a farmer. And I said, "Well, just, we'll test other people, don't worry, but, consider Kier Dullea." And Ellison's like, "No, I'm not considering Kier Dullea. I don't want Kier Dullea. He's got a cheesy mustache, and he always plays a psycho killer, and I don't want, him taking on this role." Well, turns out they'd already done a deal with Kier, and in the marketing that they were doing, primarily for American distribution, they had Kier do a little pitch about, oh, this is a great show, and it's written by Harlan Ellison, and it's going to be fantastic, and we got Ben Bova as the science consultant, et cetera, et cetera. Ellison was, needless to say, upset, but, you know, nothing he could do about it, and so he starts writing. He goes ahead and writes the Bible. He goes ahead and writes a screenplay for the first episode, which is going to be called Phoenix Without Ashes. Now, that's a great title, and really, I think, you know, was very intriguing and set up the plot. Well, they even changed that. They changed it from Phoenix Without Ashes to Voyage of Discovery, which is really boring, and it's appropriate because the episode was boring. And the second thing they did that really screwed the show was, and as I said, the basic premise is that they have to get to the back of the ship to find the bridge, because it's 200 miles long, and it's going to take them like years and years to get there. Well, they showed the bridge in the first episode, and Ellison was like, what are you doing? If you show the bridge in the first episode, the whole series is over. The whole point was that they have to get to the bridge. He says, the executive producer says, well, suppose it's just the backup bridge. Ellison says that they find. He says, do you even know what a backup bridge is? And he says, sure, isn't it the bridge that's at the back of the set? And he starts tearing his hair out. He says, that's it. I'm off. I'm not, you can't use my name on this. I'm going to use my pseudonym, Cordwainer Bird. For those unfamiliar, a cordwainer is a shoemaker, but the term Cordwainer Bird is a tribute to Ellison's friend, the science fiction writer Paul D.F. Leuenbarger, who used the pseudonym Cordwainer Smith. If you have not read any of Cordwainer Smith's works, you should. I highly recommend the collection called Norstralia, and also the story called The Ballad of Lost Camel, a really good story, and very terrific writer. He was most famous for writing a story called Scanners Live in Vain. Nobody knew who wrote it. Nobody knew who Cordwainer Smith was. So as a tribute to Leuenbarger, to Cordwainer Smith, he called himself Cordwainer Bird. Bird as in, this is for the birds, or giving somebody the bird, i.e. this is not my best work. So if you see the name Cordwainer Bird instead of Harlan Ellison, you know somebody's tried to screw him over. And that name appears as the creator of the Starlost. 16 really horrible episodes of boring science fiction that is mind-numbingly dumb. Ben Bova quit after the writers would not, who again had never written science fiction, would not take out a line that a guy said he was dying of quote-unquote radiation virus. Bova says there's no such thing as a radiation virus. Radiation is not a virus. You can't get a radiation virus. Well, they wouldn't take it out, and the guy says, I'm dying of radiation virus in the episode. And so Bova took his name off as script consultant. Ellison's name was now not on it, and they went ahead with the production. The only saving grace, if it is one, is that there are a couple of episodes with Walter Koenig, who plays an interesting character called the Alien Oro. But even those episodes are not particularly well written. The only really good thing about them is one of them includes the beautiful Spanish actress Alexandra Bastido. If you do not know who she is, watch The Blood-Spattered Bride by Jess Franco. Just a gorgeous woman. But doesn't save the show because, again, it was so dumbed down and so terrible. It could have been fantastic. Ben Bova wrote a kind of a commentary on it called a novel called The Star-Crossed, about a writer whose science fiction series is screwed over by the producers, and that's obviously a reflection on his experience. Also, Ed Bryant, who was a great friend of Ellison's and was once living in his house, wrote an adaptation of the initial script called Phoenix Without Ashes, which, by the way, won a Writers Guild of America award for the best original screenplay. Ellison's version, not the abortion that they made. One of the few shows that I cannot recommend. It is available on YouTube if you are so curious that you have to watch it. It's just awful.